Before the invention of mechanical clocks or even the concept of minutes and seconds, the sun itself was the ruler of human time. Life in ancient villages, deserts, farms, and cities all began and ended with the rising and setting of the sun. People would wake with the first light creeping over the hills, and the world would fall silent again as the sun dipped below the horizon. There were no alarm clocks, no ticking hands on a dial, only the slow, predictable path of the sun across the sky. The morning sun wasn't just a sign to begin the day, it was the signal for every living being to get into motion. Farmers went to the fields, animals were fed, markets began to stir, and homes bustled with the rhythm of dawn. Shadows cast by tall trees or standing stones helped people know how far along the day was. When a shadow was long and stretching westward, it meant early morning. When it shortened at noon and disappeared right beneath your feet, people understood it was midday. And when it began to stretch eastward again, that told them evening was approaching. The sky itself was like a giant clock face that required no numbers, just observation and familiarity with the Earth's natural flow. People became experts in reading light. They knew the difference between the warm orange of sunrise and the cold gray of early dawn. The way the light struck a wall, or how much heat it carried, helped even children guess what time it was. This skill wasn't just useful, it was essential. In the absence of clocks, the body was trained to feel the hour. A man could sense when it was mid-morning by the warmth on his neck while walking east, and a woman preparing bread could estimate when it was nearly time to take it out of the oven by the quality of light falling through the window. Shepherds would count how many hours they had before bringing their flocks back home simply by glancing at the sun's position. Travelers used the sun to guide their way, not just for direction but for time. They needed to know how many hours of safe travel remained before nightfall. Monks in monasteries and villagers in fields alike shaped their lives around what the sun told them. Each season brought a new schedule, as the sun rose earlier or later, forcing entire communities to adjust without needing to be told. No single object was as central to human rhythm as the sun. Of course, not every day was sunny. On cloudy days, people relied on habit and the movement of others. If the baker had already opened his stall, it must be past the second hour. If the chickens had already roamed far into the yard, then the morning was well underway. Observation of people, animals, and patterns became a substitute for the missing sun. Church bells, though not tied to hours yet, were rung during prayers that followed solar cues. As people became more communal, they developed a collective sense of time through shared routines. In some areas, men known as day watchers or village elders kept track of the sun's arc more carefully than others and were relied upon to signal important times, such as noon or dusk. In marketplaces, vendors set up stalls not by hour but by how far the sun had risen above a specific building or tower. In homes, shadows creeping across the floor or the changing sound of birds told people when to eat, work, or rest. These natural indicators replaced any need for machines. Interestingly, the body itself adjusted to the sun's authority. People slept differently, usually in two separate chunks, known today as first sleep and second sleep, with a period of quiet wakefulness in between, often used for reflection, prayer, or tending fires. Without clocks, the pressure of counting minutes did not exist. Time was felt, not measured. It allowed people to rest when tired and work when the light allowed. Meals were taken not at 1 p.m. sharp, but when the stomach felt ready and the chores were done. Events such as births, deaths, and weddings were remembered not by date and time, but by reference to natural signs, the day the river froze, or 2 days after the last full moon. The world was slower but deeply in tune with its own rhythm. Time was not broken into sharp slices but was instead a flowing experience tied to light, warmth, and nature's clock. Even children were taught to notice how fast a shadow moved, or how the sky changed color before a storm, because this was how you navigated life without artificial time. In some advanced cultures, large sundials were created using stone, bronze, or wood, monuments designed to mark the hours using the sun's shadow. But even before these inventions, people used simple tools like a stick in the ground or a wall marked with chalk to estimate the time of day. In Egypt, tall obelisks served as massive time indicators, casting long shadows across temple courtyards. In China, water clocks slowly began to appear, but even then, it was the sun's authority that reigned supreme in daily life. Whether one lived in a distant village or a royal palace, the sky dictated the schedule. People didn't ask, "What time is it?" They asked, "How high is the sun?" Or, Has the shadow reached the edge of the barn? This way of living was universal. The sky was everyone's clock, the earth its face, and the people its quiet, observant readers. Before modern clocks took over our lives, humans had already begun experimenting with clever ways to capture the passing of time. Among the earliest tools was the water clock, also known as a clepsydra, which used the slow dripping or rising of water to indicate the passage of time. These clocks were made using bowls, jars, or stone vessels with tiny holes at the bottom. As water dripped out or filled up a marked container, people could estimate how much time had passed. The Egyptians used these water clocks in temples to mark prayer rituals, while the Greeks refined them for courtroom speeches to limit how long someone could talk. In ancient China and Babylon, elaborate water clocks were built with mechanical components like floats, wheels, and even figures that moved or rang bells. These inventions were not just about knowing the hour, they represented a growing human desire to divide the day, to measure it, and to control it. Still, the accuracy depended on the environment. If the temperature was too cold, the water would freeze. If too hot, it evaporated faster. Yet people continued refining these tools, marking a slow but steady departure from a world ruled entirely by the sun. Another fascinating invention was the candle clock, a device so simple and yet so effective that it remained in use for centuries. These candles were specially made to burn at a steady rate, often with evenly spaced markings along their sides. Each mark represented a certain amount of time, such as an hour or half-hour. As the flame consumed the wax, the candle would shrink, and the markings would disappear one by one. In dark monasteries, sailors' quarters, or windowless castles, where sunlight was useless, candle clocks became vital. Some even included embedded nails or beads at each mark that would drop onto a metal plate when the wax melted to that level, producing a sound, a primitive yet brilliant form of an alarm clock. In Japan, incense sticks were used similarly, and in Islamic civilizations, oil lamps were marked to measure prayer intervals. The candle clock wasn't just a timer, it was a silent companion through long winter nights and a beacon during early morning rituals. The gentle flame did more than illuminate, it reminded people that time was always melting away, drop by drop, in the background of their lives. In medieval Europe, especially inside monasteries, the need for precise timekeeping grew stronger. Monks were required to pray at exact hours, known as the canonical hours, like matins before dawn, lauds at sunrise, and vespers at sunset. Since sunlight was inconsistent, these communities turned to mechanical inventions. Early mechanical clocks, driven by weights, gears, and escapements, began to appear in the 13th and 14th centuries. These clocks were massive and not kept in homes but mounted in bell towers or churches. They did not have faces or hands like modern clocks. Instead, they rang bells to signal the passage of each hour. People did not need to see the time, they heard it. Villagers planned their day by the sound of the bell. One ring for sunrise, another for mid-morning, and a series of deep tones marking sunset. These mechanical clocks slowly reshaped how people thought about time. Instead of seeing time as flowing and flexible, they began to feel it as something that could be counted, managed, and scheduled. It was a cultural shift, from living by nature's rhythms to living by machines. Even with the rise of mechanical clocks, these older methods didn't disappear overnight. In many rural areas, people continued to rely on candle clocks, dripping water, or the turning stars to tell time. Farmers still watched the dew on the grass or the crowing of roosters. Children still learned to read shadows before they ever saw a clock. The mechanical clocks were expensive and limited mostly to cities and religious institutions. And they were not yet very accurate, sometimes off by hours. People often had to reset them using sundials, which stayed in public squares as a backup to the newer machines. There was also mistrust. Some believed that trying to control time was interfering with divine will. Others simply couldn't afford to care about exact hours. What mattered more was whether the cows had been milked, the crops had been watered, and the day's bread had been baked before dusk. The human relationship with time was still tangled with natural events and shared community routines, even as machines tried to impose order on it. And yet, it was precisely during this time that the seeds of modern time obsession were planted. As cities grew, trade expanded, and people moved from farms to factories, the need for coordinated schedules became stronger. Merchants needed to know when a shipment would arrive. Officials had to keep records of meetings. Scholars required accurate timing for astronomy. These pressures pushed inventors to refine clock designs. Pendulums were introduced. Gears were sharpened. Faces were drawn with hands that pointed to numbers. Slowly, people began to check the hour not by the sun but by the ticking device on the wall. Time was no longer observed, it was kept, owned, and enforced. And all of this came from the humble beginnings of dripping water and flickering wax. Before the polished gold watches and digital alarms we carry today, time was a dancing flame, a silent drip, and a patient shadow. It was fragile, imprecise, but deeply human. Long before personal watches or wall clocks found their place in every home, it was the distant toll of a church bell that guided daily life for most people in medieval Europe. For the common villager who could neither read nor afford any kind of timekeeping device, the bell tower became the beating heart of the day. These great bronze bells, suspended high above the towns and countryside, didn't merely ring to mark the passage of hours. They commanded behavior, set the rhythm of society, and announced everything from sunrise to supper, from mass to market, from work to rest. And while the bells seemed to speak to everyone, they were not operated by some magical force. Behind each bell's ring was the strict schedule of the monastic orders, particularly the Benedictine monks, whose lives revolved entirely around the division of time. Their day wasn't just broken into morning, noon, and night. It was sectioned into canonical hours: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline, a rigorous cycle of prayer, reflection, and labor, all regulated with astonishing discipline, long before any mechanical clock existed. Inside the cold stone walls of monasteries, time was sacred, and it was sacred because it was divided. The Benedictine rule, established in the 6th century, laid out a complete timetable for every single action of a monk's life. Prayer at exactly the right moment, meals at exactly the right interval, manual labor, study, sleep, nothing was free from time's control. And without clocks, the early monks learned to read the world as a timepiece. The length of shadows, the song of birds, the feel of the air at different hours, the shifting colors of the sky. Some monks were given the responsibility of keeping this sacred schedule, known as the sacristans or timekeepers. They would rise while others slept, gauging the darkness to know when it was time to ring the bell for matins, which could be as early as 2 or 3 a.m. Slowly, over centuries, these religious timekeepers began using sundials and water clocks to stay accurate. But even these early tools were unreliable during storms, winters, or long cloudy days. So the monks continued relying on memory, nature, and repetition, turning their lives into a human clock, living, breathing, and disciplined by devotion. Over time, as monasteries grew in power and wealth, they began installing large mechanical clocks, some of the earliest examples in Europe, not for convenience, but as a deeper form of religious expression. These clocks weren't small domestic items but towering machines, housed inside cathedrals, with gears of wood and iron, driven by falling weights and regulated by escapements. The sound of these new inventions transformed entire towns. Church bells now rang on the hour, every hour, reminding citizens of divine time and the structure that underpinned their lives. Even people who had no idea how a clock worked came to associate the sound of a bell with specific actions. A bell in the morning signaled the start of labor. A noon bell meant rest. A bell in the evening called for prayers and silence. The village carpenter, the farmer, the baker, all tuned their days to these sounds. It wasn't a matter of knowing the time, it was about being told what to do. In this sense, the church bell was less a clock and more a command. Its voice echoed across forests, rivers, and stone alleys, shaping time not as something you chose, but as something that chose you. Outside the churches and monasteries, people developed their own way of relating to the bells. In towns, special bell signals indicated specific activities: markets opening, curfews beginning, emergencies like fires or attacks, or even the start of executions. Bells rang faster or slower depending on the event, and each village had its own unique tone and pattern. In many regions, bells were blessed like holy objects and believed to have protective power over the land. If a storm threatened crops, the bell was rung to scare away the clouds. If disease swept through a village, the bell was tolled for the dead and the living alike, creating a mournful rhythm to daily life. But perhaps most importantly, bells created a shared experience of time. Whether you were rich or poor, literate or not, a child or elder, you lived by the same hourly sounds. Everyone knew when it was noon, when it was time for Mass, when silence must fall. In this sense, time was communal, heard, not seen, felt, not calculated. There were no personal schedules, no individual alarms, no customized watches, just one shared rhythm, dictated by the echoing voice of the tower. And yet, this deep connection between sound, space, and society slowly began to change. As mechanical clocks grew more accurate and more widespread, the bells began to compete with visual time, with hands pointing at numbers, with personal timepieces, with an increasingly secular understanding of life. But for centuries, the bell remained king. It governed the world from above, its tones both sacred and mundane. Its authority was unquestioned, even in silence. And for the people of the Middle Ages, who lived without digital screens or ticking seconds, time was something you felt in your bones, a rumble in the stone walls, a vibration in the wooden beams, a slow rhythm rising from the earth, reaching up to the heavens, carried by the wind. In that world, no one needed to ask, "What time is it?" They simply waited and listened. Before clocks, before watches, before any mechanical whisper of ticking hands, human beings looked up to the vast, eternal sky to understand the passage of time. The sun, the stars, the shifting light, they were the earliest and most universal clocks, visible to all yet owned by none. In ancient times, when no bells tolled and no gears turned, the daily arc of the sun was the only true ruler of life. People woke with the dawn, labored as long as shadows shortened, and returned home as light faded into twilight. This wasn't just guesswork, it was observation passed down through generations. Farmers knew precisely when the sun crested a particular tree or struck a stone at a certain angle. It meant it was time to feed animals, start planting, or end a field task. In Egypt, temple priests built massive obelisks not merely for spiritual power, but to cast long shadows across the sand. Shadows that moved predictably, measuring hours even before the term hour existed. A single shaft of stone could break the day into meaningful segments. But more than that, the sun didn't just tell time, it gave time shape. Noon was not 12 o'clock, it was when the sun stood still at its highest point. Morning was the slow rise of warmth and light. Evening was the gentle golden glow before darkness claimed the earth. Time was a feeling, not a number. As darkness arrived, people once again turned their eyes upward, this time to the stars, the most ancient and reliable of timekeepers. Civilizations across the world read the sky like a cosmic calendar. In Mesopotamia, priests mapped constellations to determine sacred rituals and agricultural seasons. The Greeks named stars and tracked their rising and setting as a way of defining months. In Polynesia, navigators used the stars as a living compass, charting thousands of miles of ocean without maps, simply by memorizing the patterns of starlight. And in medieval Europe, people knew that the appearance of certain constellations signaled changes in weather, festivals, and harvests. The Pleiades meant winter was coming. Orion signaled hunting season. The North Star, ever still, guided both sailors and shepherds home. Time wasn't limited to day and night, it was woven into the yearly cycle of the cosmos. The slow drift of stars across seasons reminded people of the long, circular nature of life. There was no rush. There was only rhythm. The celestial dome above was not just a backdrop for myths, but a living, breathing timepiece, enormous, beautiful, and constant. In a world without screens, every night was a silent lesson in patience and continuity. Even more intricate than the stars were the shadows, simple yet profoundly accurate. Ancient sundials, carved into stone or drawn onto walls, turned the movement of the sun into a readable instrument. A stick planted into the ground, or a small gnomon on a plate, could tell the time based on where its shadow fell. The Greeks perfected sundials for city use, placing them in public squares where everyone could check the time. In Rome, wealthy homes had personal sundials, carved from marble, used to time meals or meetings. But beyond instruments, people also read shadows from memory. A shadow reaching the corner of a building, a tree's shadow falling across a path, or the sunbeam striking a temple arch, all served as signals to begin or end daily routines. And in places where no sun reached, cloudy lands or dense forests, people learned to tell time by the direction of wind, the chill of air, or the call of certain birds. It was a dance between body and world. Your skin could feel the hour, your eyes could read it on the land. There was no need for precision because life was not scheduled. It was seasonal, flowing, and deeply tuned to nature's language. Different cultures developed unique ways of mapping this natural time. In China, time was measured using incense clocks, long trails of burning incense laid out in intricate shapes that released fragrance at hourly intervals. In Islamic culture, the need to pray 5 times a day gave rise to sophisticated methods of solar timekeeping, where scholars like Al-Biruni developed elaborate sundials and instruments to determine the exact moment of each prayer. In India, the Jantar-Mantar observatories used giant stone structures to track celestial movement with astonishing precision. Yet even the most advanced pre-clock systems didn't turn time into a number on a dial. Time remained experiential. It was part of the environment, part of the divine order, part of the mystery. The more one observed, the more one learned. A cloud formation could suggest the hour as clearly as a ticking hand. Time was written in birdsong, in flower bloom, in the buzzing quiet before sunset. It was not bound by artificial minutes, but by movement, by light, by repetition. People didn't just look at time, they lived inside it. And then came the profound truth. In this ancient world, no two people lived by the exact same time. Your valley might see sunrise an hour before the neighboring village. Your tree's shadow might differ depending on the hill it stood on. Time was deeply local, even personal. This was not a problem. It was accepted, even welcomed. There was no pressure to sync with anyone. No anxiety of being late. Life flowed like the river, slower in some places, faster in others, but always natural. When the sun reached a certain point in the sky, people knew it was time to rest. When the stars appeared in a familiar order, they knew the season was changing. When a shadow fell over a doorway, it meant dinner was near. This kind of time didn't divide life. It wove it together. It was not mechanical, but organic. Not fixed, but fluid. Not controlled, but felt. In that world, time was not something you chased. It was something you danced with. In the absence of minutes and seconds, life unfolded like a gentle tide, slow, patient, and unmeasured. There were no alarms, no hourly chimes, no digital pings pulling people forward. Instead, the day came in like a slow fog over the hills, seeping into every corner of a village or farm. Morning was not 7 a.m., but the soft light that crept through the wooden shutters, the hush of dew on the grass, the quiet snort of animals waking in the barn. People stretched not because a bell told them to, but because the body, long attuned to light and season, knew it was time to rise. There was no need to count how long breakfast took. A bowl of grain, a sip of fresh water, a few words with family, and the subtle understanding that the sun had reached its place above the treetops meant work must begin. Across regions and cultures, people lived with time not as a dictator, but as a companion, something that walked beside them rather than dragged them forward. They moved when it felt right, not when a device insisted. And so, life did not feel rushed or fragmented. It felt full. When no one wore a watch, there was no race against time. One could visit a neighbor and stay for a while, 10 minutes, or perhaps an hour, but no one truly knew. A conversation wasn't cut short by the worry of being late. A story wasn't rushed because something else was scheduled. The world was allowed to breathe. Craftsmen carved wood and stitched cloth by feel, not stopwatch. Meals were made until they were done, not when a timer rang. Journeys were measured by shadows on the road, not miles per hour. A child playing in the field did not think of recess ending in 20 minutes. He simply played until his stomach grumbled or the wind shifted. Time was not sliced thin like it is now. It was thick, whole, like a loaf of bread fresh from the oven. People sank into their moments fully. They tasted time, sat with it, allowed it to pass without resistance. And in that slow passing, there was peace. Deep, nourishing, uncomplicated peace. In monasteries and temples, where silence and stillness were sacred, monks and mystics learned to tell time by the sunbeam's path across stone floors. They lit candles that burned steadily, marking hours with dripping wax. And yet, even they were not obsessed with exactness. What mattered was rhythm, prayer at dawn, meditation at noon, reflection at dusk. Life was not squeezed into 24 exact segments. It was shaped by repetition, tradition, and feeling. In homes and hamlets, mothers taught daughters when to begin kneading the bread dough not by clock, but by watching how long the shadows had grown. Grandfathers knew it was time to head home from the fields when the crows began to gather or when the air took on that dusky coolness. The passage of time was a kind of sensory experience, seen, smelled, heard, even tasted. You didn't need to ask, "What time is it?" You only needed to notice the world around you. And if you didn't notice, that was fine too. Time forgave you. The absence of precise timekeeping also meant that people experienced less anxiety. There was no, "I'm 5 minutes late," no guilt for a delay, no panic about squeezing too much into an hour. Events happened when everyone was ready, not when the minute hand landed. Weddings began when all were gathered. Meals were served when the food was ready. Harvest started when the crops turned gold, not on a scheduled Monday. Even cities, with their marketplaces and travelers, adjusted to the rising and setting of the sun. Traders would open stalls when light was good and close them when the air grew heavy with twilight. It was imperfect, yes, but it worked. Life was not broken into fragments, and so the soul didn't feel fractured. There was room to pause, room to listen, room to be. Without the ticking of clocks, people lived inside a kind of temporal freedom, one we can barely imagine today. And perhaps most beautifully, time back then was shared, not privatized. In the modern world, everyone carries their own time, locked in a phone, in a watch, in a calendar app. But before clocks, time was communal. A village shared the bell that rang at noon. A family shared the call of roosters at dawn. A tribe shared the blooming of a flower that marked the changing season. Time belonged to the group, not the individual. It flowed through the community like wind through tall grass. And this shared sense of time created harmony. People moved together, worked together, rested together. There was less loneliness in time. And so, while there may have been no precision, there was deep connection, to nature, to each other, to something greater. Time was not a straight line, but a circle, a rhythm, a breath. And though it may seem chaotic to us now, there was a quiet order in that ancient flow. A simplicity, a calm, a truth. One that, even today, some part of us still longs to return to.